All right, everybody, welcome back. This is RealFootballAnalysis.com. Welcome to the 2016 season. This will be our kickoff season preview. And so we're ready for a brand new season, and we're ready to give you some of the analysis that you don't get anywhere else. Now, what makes us so different is that we don't really cover a lot of the fluff. Players, the skilled players and all that. We cover the players that we feel make a big difference, the ones in the trenches. And the reason why the traditional media doesn't cover that as much, you won't see that on ESPN as much, is because it's very tedious to get down and dirty and follow some of these names that are not so recognizable. A lot of big names that we follow are being cut nowadays, for example, and they don't even make a splash at all. When you get rid of a player like Brandon Mebane or Tony McDaniel, like Seattle did last year, and Brandon Mebane this year, it makes a difference. And one of the things is Seattle is not automatically a great defense, especially in a year where they're rebuilding that defensive line a little bit on the interior, and especially in a year where they're rebuilding their offensive line. So there was going to be a lot of change. It was not so unexpected that Seattle struggled at the beginning of the season last year with what kind of rebuilding they were doing in their trenches, and they're even doing some more this year. And it wasn't just all Cam Chancellor not being there or being there, or some big name signings on offense and the skilled players. So we take a look at a lot of players that the traditional media doesn't. For example, at this time last year, people were trying to guess, who's going to be that team that makes it into the playoffs that didn't make it last year. Who's going to be those teams that made it into the playoffs that won't? And one of the teams they didn't talk about so much was Carolina. Why? Because they said they didn't have any weapons. Well, we see here we were looking at it differently last preseason. Before the season started, we saw an evolving defensive line. We saw an evolving offensive line. We knew there was going to be great tackling and blocking. And just like Ron Rivera and the folks were not panicking, they were not going out and signing big names like Andre Johnson like the Colts did. They did just fine at the skilled players. In fact, Ted Ginn had a really great season. He became more than just a returner, a kick returner type of name. So, Real Football Analysis, we take a look at football in a different angle. We look at it from the trenches, and we follow names. We follow defensive tackle tandems that you wouldn't necessarily hear about. You wouldn't know that Seattle's defensive tackle tandem that took them to the Super Bowl was Brandon Mebane and Tony McDaniel, and they jettisoned Tony McDaniel last year. He came back to the squad after a year away, but only signed after training camp started as one of those journeyman type deals, and they might need him now that Jordan Hill is not available for them. So now let's talk about, in this season preview, we want to talk about, not get so much in the nitty-gritty details like we did in the last two podcasts, but we want to just talk about who could be in the Super Bowl. Who are the teams that could be? Well, at this point, we know every year there are a lot of surprises, right? But we look for stability. That's one of the things we look for, and we hope that leads to some kind of success. Often or not, in a wacky game like football, sometimes a better team doesn't win because of turnovers and weird plays and whatnot, and that's why we have the football ERA formula, which looks at the game and subtracts out those unearned runs, we call it. That's why it's called the ERA. Taking a baseball term, earned run average, and we're trying to look at who did well in the trenches and subtract out the turnovers as unearned runs and try to look at what teams earn and see how that reflects on a scoreboard that's different from the real scoreboard. However, luck is a factor in football, and one of the things that determines whether or not you come out in December going down the playoff stretch with flying colors is whether or not you suffered from injuries. So injuries is a big factor. And who's going to have the injuries, who's not, we don't know. We know teams with more stability at the head coach's level, like the Steelers, they rebuild faster and they have more depth because of stability there. But the Steelers right now, per se, are rebuilding their defense. Their offensive line has come around. We saw what effect that had on their offense. Their offense seemed to really come around, but their defense is still rebuilding. So we don't know. They're a question mark whether they're going to really be able to grow their defense, survive injuries, and become a contender. But a lot of people have them that way. Now let's look at the AFC a little bit closer. The North there has stability in the Bengals. So the Bengals could be a name we talk about as a playoff team. They need to develop a little bit more of a pass rush and a solid running game. And then we'll see whether they can take the next step. The Ravens last year had a lot of injuries. They still got a decent defensive rebuilding. A lot of rebuilding going on both sides of the ball on the trenches. So they're a little bit of a question mark. So anybody else in the AFC, do we see any kind of rising, an upward arrow? The one team that we can say is going up, especially on defense, is the Patriots. So the Patriots, once again, who have been winning without that defense that they had back in the Teddy Bruschi years, are once again a team to watch. So far, though, this early training camp and preseason is also a time for injuries. And so far, they've had quite a few injuries with Trey Jackson, Shaq Mason, some of the young guys. They got rid of Brian Stork. They have a plan. At least it happened early, but they're already doing some shuffling on the offensive line. So we'll see what happens early in the season, but it's a long season. They are the one team, when it comes to injuries, that have won despite injuries in the trenches. So one of the things that injuries do, whether you win or lose, most of the time it affects your wins. But you do develop some depth out of that adversity because young guys that have to step up, next man up, have to step up, come off the bench, and they get playing experience. And football is one of those games, especially on defense, where you need that live game experience. So we see that on teams that come back from adversity, if they don't lose their head coach with some stability, and they bring back those guys that did play, they get deeper because of adversity. Now, Patriots have that. They have a lot of adversity. Despite rebuilding their offensive line the last few years now, they come back with players that have played when others were injured, and they have a little bit of depth, so they're able to handle some of those injuries. And especially now they've been building up on defense. So Patriots, who else could be challenging the AFC besides what we mentioned? The Bengals, perhaps the Steelers are a question mark. Well, I think the South is wide open. The West is wide open. Could it be the Chiefs that come out? Could it be the Raiders? Could the Chargers finally turn around because Mike McCoy can finally have a year where the offensive line doesn't have a slew of injuries? There might be some depth there from that, from players coming in finally. And we don't know. There's just a lot of question marks there. The Jaguars, hey, that's a mystery team. That could be a team that finally puts it together. They had a lot of personnel additions in free agencies, a lot of good acts. Malik Jackson, and other guys, whatnot, on their defense. So hopefully we can see whether they become one of those teams or not and finally put it together. Of course, injuries is a big factor, and we know as the season evolves, every month is a different season. Patriots in the AFC could be a team that we mentioned in early, Super Bowl predictions. What about the NFC? Well, the NFC East is wide open, and we have to go down to the north to finally look at teams like the Packers and the Vikings. Despite losing Bridgewater, I think the Vikings still are a solid team. They didn't lose anybody in the trenches and behind either Bradford or even Sean Hill, whoever they plug in. I think they still can be a very solid team because they're very solid blocking and tackling. And so they will contend in the north with the Packers, who look like they're poised to come along. I don't know how they'll survive a little bit of a youth movement like cutting Josh Sitton and other guys that are surprise cuts that we hear about these days, just happening this weekend. However, as the season develops and they have a plan, if their young guys are as good, they mix in with their veterans, I think the Packers are evolving a little bit on both sides of the ball. They do lose B.J. Raji, their nose tackle, so that's a little bit of a hit. We do look at, that interior defensive line as having an impact, and it will. And we'll see whether they kind of hold their fort down with their offense and the rest of their defense having some stability and growth, whether they can gel. But I think the Packers are a team that are mentionable as a contender in the NFC. The Vikings will be competing with the Packers in the north. The Carolina Panthers, extremely stable. Not much losses there. They're still solid in the trenches. They get Kelvin Benjamin back if you're worried about weapons. So the Panthers are another team that's very obvious, I know, but because they weren't impacted by free agency, I think they're going to come back around. They're going to be the team that probably the Packers or some other team in the championship has to beat. So we have to look solidly at that because the rest of the the NFC South is up for grabs. Now, when we look at the NFC West, another division that's really up for grabs. Seattle's going to be competing as they rebuild, and the Rams could finally show up with that defense they have, especially that defensive line, and put it together, with another year under Jeff Fisher. However, the Cardinals are the one that really look like they're taking a step forward. They identified their pass rush as an area of needing more strength, and they added Chandler Jones at the expense of the Patriots, and they're trying to improve in that area. I think they're doing a little bit of rebuilding on the offensive line, but I think they're another team people are watching as a possible contender to get in that NFC Championship game. So there you have it. We got the Cardinals, we got the Panthers, Packers, Vikings in the mix in the NFC. AFC's a little bit more wide open. We will watch the Patriots as a team to watch, but I think those are the teams you would pencil in as possible Super Bowl previews. As we go along, pay attention to what we do with the football ERA formula. It really brings new insight into what teams did well, maybe but lost, what teams did well and won on Sunday, what teams with a losing record are probably playing better than their record and may make a big turnaround and surge. And so teams are not always defined by their record so much. A lot of things happen in the game, like luck and things like that. So the football ERA will illuminate a lot of the performances, and we'll be analyzing with that. So stay tuned for that during the season. Enjoy. Get your fantasy football drafts done as we get out of Labor Day weekend. We got a first game this Thursday, September 8th. So look forward to seeing you back here at realfootballanalysis.com, the football ERA formula.